Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I went through this bill, and frankly, I couldn't understand who would put this together the way it is. I'm new here, so I'm not all that familiar with how the sausage is always made. So I'm just, it makes me curious as to how the words actually got onto this piece of paper. Mr. Chairman, you said that this provides protection to domestic violence victims, and it doesn't. It makes the law much more dangerous for victims and potential victims of domestic violence. It does not make it better. It makes it much, much worse. Whoever put these words on this piece of paper could not possibly have heard the same testimony that we heard. We heard testimony until 3 o'clock in the morning from all kinds of people who explained exactly why the words on this piece of paper will make it more dangerous for victims of domestic violence. We heard from Brooke Cheney. Brooke Cheney is a female firearms instructor. Her clients, the people who she teaches to handle firearms, are victims of domestic violence. Her clients are learning to handle firearms in order to protect themselves from their abusers. This bill would allow their abusers to disarm them. It baffles me why we would want to do that. Victims of domestic violence need to be able to protect themselves from their abusers, and this bill would allow the abusers to prevent them from protecting themselves. Why would we ever want to do that? We heard from attorney Rachel Baird. I apologize. Rachel Baird. She practices in this field and explained that there are huge numbers of false accusations and false TROs issued, very often by the very people we're trying to target here, but we're not doing it right. She testified that there are up to 40% of TROs are issued against the wrong person. If that's the case, this bill would allow the abusers to issue or to swear out a TRO against the domestic violence victim and have them disarmed and have their protections stripped from them without any hearing. I don't understand why we would want to do that. We need to be able to give the domestic violence victim an opportunity to get in front of a judge and explain that the TRO is directed at the wrong person. This doesn't do that. This prohibits that. This strips the domestic violence victim of their right to protect themselves for up to 14 days. That very window that supposedly is we're trying to close. This bill is going in the wrong direction. We heard from Mary Jackson. We heard that this bill was supposedly in response to the attack on Mary Jackson and her daughter. They were victims of a horrific crime. They were victims of a domestic violence, a domestic abuser who tracked them down, smashed down their door, and shot them both. That abuser had a TRO issued against him, but it was never served. That TRO had in it that he was not supposed to have access to firearms, but it was never served. if Mary Jackson and her daughter were able to protect themselves, perhaps they might have. But instead, they called the police. And by the time the police got there, they had already been shot. This bill would do absolutely nothing to help them in that situation. And Mary Jackson testified to that very thing. She said that this bill would not have prevented that tragedy. We heard from Ray Beavis. Ray Beavis' girlfriend, her ex, was in prison for violence perpetrated against her. He was a violent abuser of women and children. When he got out of prison, the girlfriend and her children were terrified that he would perpetrate violence on them. So Ray took them into his home. Ray took them into his home to protect them from this violent abuser, criminal. When the criminal got out of jail, what did he do? He had a temporary restraining order issued against Ray, got him out of his house falsely. Under this bill, it would also give that violent offender the opportunity to strip that abuse victim and her children of their ability to protect themselves. This is a bad bill. It would leave the victims helpless and not give them the opportunity to get in front of a judge and say, "Judge, this TRO has been issued in error. You can't take away my right to protect myself." This bill would prevent that. We also heard testimony from any number of people who said that they'd never heard of the risk warrant statute. Never heard of it. In some of these instances, relying on the risk warrant statute as opposed to a TRO could have protected the victims, because under the risk warrant statute, which is already law in this state, there is probable cause, the police are involved, the police go in, seize the firearms. No questions. Because there is a showing that the person with the firearms presents a risk to the victim, to the public, perhaps to him or herself. There is due process. There is probable cause. There is a warrant. And they go in and they just seize them. That's already on the books. But nobody knew about it. We had testimony from domestic violence organizations that are dedicated to protecting abuse victims. They said they'd never heard of it. That's a problem. We need to come up with a way that they know about it, and that any victim who is likely to go and try to issue and have a TRO issued knows that if it's an emergency, if there's a real risk, they can rely on the risk warrant statute. This bill doesn't do anything about that. What it does do is it changes service. It says if there's a firearm involved in any way, the police have to effectuate service. Now that brings up all kinds of issues. Police go knocking on the door to serve somebody with a risk warrant, with a TRO. Anything that they see is fair game. They go knocking on somebody's door in the middle of the night to hand them a TRO. Door opens up. They see something on the table. It's in plain view. Now they make a phone call, warrant, arrest. Everything in there is now fair game for the police. Under the current law, TROs are issued by marshals. not the same thing. What we need is due process. The victims need due process. The recipients of the orders need due process. Now, the problem with not having due process is that there is no opportunity, as I said, to have to go tell the judge that they've got the wrong person. The other problem is that even under this amendment that we just passed, there's nothing about the firearms. So if your firearms are taken, or if you're compelled to sell them, there's no way to get them back. And we heard testimony that it can take, with regard to the permit, and I don't think this amendment solves this problem, but with regard to your permit and your right to purchase firearms, that it could take up to 2 to 3 years to get it back, even if you're found to have done absolutely nothing wrong. After the hearing, the judge says, you're right, you shouldn't have had a TRO issued against you. Or the victim goes up to the judge finally at a hearing and says, Judge, you got the wrong person. That guy just got out of jail for beating me up. He issued a TRO against me. That's wrong. The judge says, you're right, pulls the TRO. Now you have to reapply for your permit. I do not think that this amendment solves that problem. That's not due process. Even if you have a hearing, you still lose your firearms. Even if you have a hearing and you're found not to have done anything wrong, you still lose your firearms and you still lose your permit. That's not due process. Even the gun control people who testified, and even the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence testified, that whatever bill comes out must have a provision that immediately after you are found not to have done anything wrong, immediately after your hearing and the judge determines that the TRO was issued in error, you need to get your licenses back, your permits back, you need to get your firearms back. This bill does not do that. So however the words got on this piece of paper, I do not believe that they could have been put on this paper by somebody who heard that testimony. Now again, I'm new to this game. I'm not sure how the sausage is made. But I did sit here 3 days ago and offered to cooperate with anybody, to work with the other side, work with the chair, work with the governor's office, to craft a really good, strong domestic violence prevention bill. And I still will do that. You know, there is a way to make a bill that is really geared towards preventing domestic violence. This bill is not it. Because we can protect women and children from domestic violence, but because I see what's on this piece of paper, it appears to me, at least initially, that those offers have been rebuffed. Now, I understand there is discussion about working on the governor's bill, and I appreciate that, and I will certainly work to make the governor's bill something that really focuses on domestic violence, which it should. But this bill, 650, the one we're talking about now, is not that bill. This is just a gun control bill. That's all it is. And there isn't any way to couch it as anything other than that because it doesn't address the issues of domestic violence. We need to have a bill that protects domestic violence abuse victims while it's protecting our cherished rights of due process, being free from unwarranted searches and seizures, and making sure we have our rights of personal protection, making sure that our domestic violence victims are not stripped of their right to protect themselves. Now, under this bill, we just imagine this scenario. Women and children are terrorized by abusive felon ex-husband. They hold up in their house to protect themselves, and the woman arms herself to protect herself against the violent felon. This is a very almost the same scenario we heard with Ray Beavis. Then there's a knock on the door. Police officer, I have a order to serve you with. Hands her the TRO. Here's your temporary restraining order. I understand you have a firearm. I need to take it. This woman the woman and her children are terrorized by an abusive ex-husband, and the police officer takes away her only means of protection. Well, now you get a hearing in 14 days. Have a nice day. This is exactly what Brooke Cheney and Ray Beavis warned us about. These are real-life examples. It's not hypotheticals. This really happens in this state. And if the abuser smashes in the door and they call the police, very often the police don't get there in time. Mary Jackson testified to that. Another issue which hasn't been discussed. In House Bill 650, it talks, Senate Bill 650, thank you, talks about what restraining orders are enforceable in this state under this bill. It includes foreign orders. Foreign orders. Has anybody thought about what a foreign order is? Foreign order is an order issued by another state. Well, those other states, from my research and from the research of others, do not include an order that firearms are confiscated or that the recipient is compelled to sell them. So that means that an order from a judge in another state that required nothing except staying out of a house, if sent into Connecticut, will now require that firearms be seized. So one can imagine the scenario. Somebody from Arizona goes to a judge and says, "Judge, my wife beat me. I want her to stay out of the house." Well, that wife has armed herself in Connecticut because she's afraid of this guy. So the judge, not thinking that anybody's firearms are going to be taken, that anybody is going to be disarmed, says, "Okay, I'll give you a TRO to keep the woman out of the house in Arizona." Well, the husband now sends the order into Connecticut and has it served on her in Connecticut. Well, in Connecticut now, under this law, that woman is going to be disarmed. Even though the judge had no intention of disarming her in Arizona, that foreign order must be given full faith and credit. So in Connecticut, we're going to disarm that woman and prevent her from protecting herself against her abuser. That is not due process. And that is not safe. That is not good law. And under the full faith and there's a federal statute that says that temporary restraining orders should be given full faith and credit across state lines. Well, if we will be the only state in the nation that requires the seizure of firearms without a hearing on a temporary restraining order, will other states recognize our temporary restraining orders? under federal law? No, they won't, because federal law requires that you be given due process, and we will not be giving due process. I know the goal of everybody in this room is to ensure that domestic violence victims are protected. We all sat through that testimony, heart-wrenching testimony in some instances, by people who went through real-life situations and truly need protection under our law. This bill, Senate Bill 650, does not do that. In fact, it makes the law much, much worse and puts them at considerably more danger. If Senate Bill 650 becomes law, women and children will die unnecessarily. There are far better ways to protect domestic violence victims than a short-sighted gun control bill. I know the people in this room want to create such a bill, and I will do everything I can to help do that. This is not the bill. I urge the people in this room and the members of this committee to vote against this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.